What happens when the world celebrates joy, but your heart feels nothing but loss? What if, on the most magical day of the year, all you have left is silence, unpaid bills, and the echo of a life that used to be yours? She didn't believe in miracles anymore. Not after everything she'd lost. Not after they took her voice, her job, her chance to matter. But what if one quiet act of kindness, given without reason, was the key to unlocking something far bigger than justice? What if helping a stranger became the first thread in a story that could mend more than just one broken life? Stay close. Because this Christmas, something extraordinary is waiting. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the gray New York sky, melting against steaming coffee cups and wool coats. The city was dressed for the season, twinkling lights, wreaths on every door, carols echoing from street corners, but none of it touched Ivy Quinn. Not this year. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her body, the cold biting through like glass. Her boots were scuffed, the soles worn thin from long walks to freelance gigs that paid late, or not at all. Rent was behind. Groceries were running low. The heating in her apartment worked only when it felt generous. And yet, she kept walking. It was Christmas morning, and Ivy had nowhere to be, no one to expect her. But somehow, her feet had led her to the old stone church on 84th and Lex, the one with the tall stained glass windows and the brass bell that rang like a heartbeat through winter. She sat in the back pew, hands folded, not praying for miracles. Just peace. A moment to breathe. A year without betrayal. A world where standing up for what's right didn't cost you everything. She had once worked at Wilder Enterprises, an efficient cog in the shiny corporate machine. Until the layoffs began. Until the whispers grew. Until she spoke up for the employees whose lives were being erased on spreadsheets. And just like that, she became one of them. Knox Wilder, the cold, brilliant CEO, had looked her in the eye and said, "This is business. Not charity." Then security had escorted her out like she was a thief. That was 10 months ago. And still, her stomach knotted at the memory. The service ended with a soft amen. People filed out in pairs, in families, in warmth. Ivy walked alone. The sky had darkened slightly. Snow still fell, gentle but steady. And then, just past the church gate, she saw him. An old man. Alone. He sat on a frozen bench near the sidewalk, hunched beneath a frayed coat too thin for the weather. His hands trembled as he wiped away a tear that had nothing to do with the cold. Ivy paused. The crowd moved around her, indifferent. But she stepped toward him. "Sir?" she asked gently. "Are you all right?" The man looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed but sharp, blue like frost under morning light. He hesitated before answering. "No one should be alone on Christmas," he said, voice raspy. "And yet, here I am." She sat beside him. No questions. No agenda. They spoke slowly. Softly. The way strangers do when the world feels just quiet enough to listen. His name was Walter. Walter Wilder. Her heart stopped at the last name, but she said nothing. He spoke of a son he hadn't seen in years. A family that had drifted into silence. A life filled with law, legacy, and loss. He didn't ask for sympathy. But Ivy gave it anyway. An hour passed. Maybe more. Eventually, she reached into her purse and pulled out the last $20 she had tucked away in a torn envelope labeled rent. "Would you join me for dinner?" she asked, her voice soft. "It won't be much, but you shouldn't be alone tonight." Walter looked at her like she'd offered him the stars. "Are you sure?" She smiled, though it was shaky. "I'm sure." That evening, they sat across from each other in her tiny apartment. The heat barely worked, the furniture didn't match, and the meal was nothing more than boxed pasta, canned soup, and half a loaf of day-old bread. But it was warm. And it was enough. 2 people. 2 stories. 1 table. And somewhere between the steam of the soup and the silence between sentences, something unspoken passed between them. Not charity. But grace. The apartment was small, but it held warmth where the world outside did not. A single string of fairy lights blinked weakly above the window, their glow reflected in the steam rising from chipped bowls of tomato soup. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, left over from a candle Ivy had burned weeks ago. Her radiator hissed quietly in the corner, doing its best to keep up with the bitter December night. Walter sat at her rickety kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea like it was gold. Ivy set down a mismatched plate of crackers and half a grilled cheese sandwich, the best she could do with what was left in her fridge. "It's not much," she said apologetically. Walter looked at her, his voice soft but firm. "It's more than anyone else offered me today." They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional clink of a spoon or a sip of tea. Ivy found herself watching him more closely, the way his eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on the unpaid bills stacked on the counter. The worn coat hung by the door. The fridge with only 2 magnets, one of which barely held up a grocery list. She didn't explain. But he noticed. "You live alone?" he asked gently. Ivy hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. It's been a tough year." She didn't mean to open up. But something about his presence, calm, knowing, unthreatening, loosened the knot in her chest. "I used to work for a big company. I fought for people I believed in. And got let go for it. They still owe me months of pay, but getting it back." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Let's just say the law doesn't care much about the little people." Walter didn't speak. He just listened, like every word mattered. And when the dishes were cleared and the old clock on the wall struck 10, he stood slowly and reached for his coat. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Tonight meant more than I can say." She walked him to the door, the corners of her eyes heavy from exhaustion. "Merry Christmas, Walter." "Merry Christmas, Ivy." The door closed with a soft click. She stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in again. Then she exhaled, pulled her laptop to her lap, and went back to sorting photos for a freelance design gig she was barely clinging to. It wasn't much, but it was something. Until... Knock. Knock. She froze. The knock came again, firmer this time. She stood, heart fluttering. Opened the door. And blinked. 3 people stood in the hallway, 2 sharply dressed lawyers with leather portfolios, and between them, Walter. But not the Walter she had known just an hour ago. He stood straighter now, his coat replaced by a thick wool overcoat, scarf folded neatly at the collar. His expression was the same, kind, but his presence was different. Weightier. Confident. Ivy's voice barely made it out. "Walter." He smiled gently. "I owe you an apology, Ivy. I wasn't entirely honest about who I am." The taller lawyer stepped forward. "Ms. Quinn, I'm Martin Green, senior partner at Wilder Associates." She blinked. "Wilder? What?" Walter nodded. "I founded the firm 30 years ago. I stepped back a few years ago, but I never really left." Ivy stared, stunned. "But you said your family, they abandoned you." "My son did," Walter said, eyes suddenly distant. "But that's a story for another day." He stepped inside, placing a thick envelope on her kitchen table. Then another. Then a check. This is for legal counsel, he said, motioning to the lawyers. We're going to help you sue Wilder Enterprises for wrongful termination and unpaid wages. And this, he gestured to the check, is a personal gift. You don't have to accept it. But I want you to know it comes without strings. Ivy was frozen. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the check. Her breath hitched. It was more than a gift. It was survival. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice cracking. Walter looked at her, quietly, firmly. Because you sat beside a stranger on Christmas morning, gave him your last $20, and offered him kindness without asking for anything in return. He stepped closer. You didn't know who I was. You didn't care. You helped me. Because it was right. Ivy swallowed hard, still shaken. I don't want to feel like I'm taking charity. Walter's gaze softened. This isn't charity, Ivy. He reached out, resting a gentle hand on hers. This is justice. And you deserve to be seen. The lawsuit was filed the first week of January. Ivy Quinn versus Wilder Enterprises. The name looked surreal on the paperwork, her name. Her case. Her chance to be heard after almost a year of being silenced. The lawyers from Wilder Associates wasted no time. Depositions. Witnesses. Emails pulled from archives. Timesheets, contracts, board memos, all the quiet paper trails Knox Wilder thought had disappeared into the void of power were coming back, piece by damning piece. And Ivy. She stood at the center of it. Not hidden behind legal jargon, not shrinking beneath corporate pressure. She showed up. Every day. She reviewed documents, testified, gave interviews to labor rights journalists. Her face began to appear in small op-eds and digital exposés about whistleblower rights and toxic workplaces. And behind the scenes, Walter was always there, quiet but steadfast, never letting her forget, you are not alone anymore. But Knox Wilder didn't go down easily. He threw lawyers at the case like fire against ice. He filed for delays. Motioned to dismiss. Claimed reputational sabotage. Accused Ivy of being unstable, desperate, even vindictive. None of it stuck. Because Ivy didn't back down. She had truth. And now, she had the fire to fight for it. By midsummer, the courtroom was packed on the final day of the hearing. Ivy stood at the front, hand steady, voice clear as she told the judge everything. How she fought for the rights of others and was punished for it. How the company owed her not just wages, but dignity. The judge's ruling came 2 weeks later. Judgment in favor of Ivy Quinn. Full compensation. Back pay. Damages. Knox Wilder never showed up to hear it. But Ivy did. She sat in the gallery, tears burning behind her eyes as the words were read aloud. Not because of the money, it was never about the money. It was about being seen. It was about being believed. After the ruling, the law firm hosted a quiet celebratory dinner. Ivy showed up in a borrowed dress and a pair of heels she hadn't worn since her sister's wedding. She toasted with sparkling cider and thanked every lawyer on Walter's team by name. That night, as the city sparkled beyond the windows, Walter approached her with a soft smile. You've won your battle, he said, handing her a thick ivory envelope. She opened it, puzzled. Inside, an invitation. Elegant calligraphy. Wax seal. You are cordially invited to the annual Wilder Family Christmas Gala. December 24th, 7 p.m. Ivy stared. Then looked up. This is your family's party. Walter smiled. There was something else in his eyes now. Something carefully unspoken. It's time you came, he said. You've earned your place. She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. Because deep down, something about the way he said it felt like a door about to open. Snow glistened on the stone driveway, sparkling like crystal under the golden exterior lights of the Wilder estate. Ivy stood at the edge of the towering iron gate, her breath catching in her throat as Walter led her up the marble steps of the grand mansion. This isn't just a Christmas party, she thought. This is something else. The butler opened the door before they even knocked, as if they were expected. Warm light spilled into the night, accompanied by the clinking of glasses and the hum of an elegant string quartet. Inside, the air was rich with pine, champagne, and wealth. Everything was immaculate: crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, silver platters of hors d'oeuvres served by men in tuxedos. And at the center of it all stood a man in a charcoal suit, his posture rigid, his gaze sharp. Knox Wilder. Ivy froze. He looked different, older than she remembered, though it had only been a year. His jaw tighter, his eyes colder. But the recognition was instant, electric. And in the same moment he saw her, his entire expression shifted. Shock. Confusion. Anger. "What is she doing here?" he said through clenched teeth, stepping forward. Walter didn't flinch. "She's my guest," he replied, his tone calm, controlled. Knox's eyes narrowed, flickering between Ivy and his father. "You brought her here? After everything she's done?" Ivy straightened. "Everything I've done? You mean fighting for the paycheck I earned? The justice you tried to bury?" Knox's jaw clenched, but his father cut in. "That's enough, both of you." His voice wasn't loud, but it commanded. For the first time, the room seemed to still. Walter turned to Knox, his gaze heavy with something deeper than disappointment. Something that had waited years to be spoken. "You know, when your mother died, I thought the pain would bring us closer. I thought you'd understand that there's more to life than numbers on a screen and empire building." Knox looked away, expression stone. "I built what you never could. I made this name matter. And in doing so, you erased its meaning." Walter stepped closer, his voice tightening. "You cut out decency for efficiency. Kindness for profit. You fired good people. You forgot family. You forgot me." Knox's face didn't change. But Ivy saw it, the flicker, the falter. Walter placed a hand on Ivy's shoulder, gently. "She gave me something you couldn't." Knox snapped, "She's a stranger." "She's not," Walter interrupted. "She sat beside me when I had nothing. She shared her food, her warmth, and her dignity. She gave without expecting a thing in return. And in that moment, she became more family to me than my own blood." The silence that followed was sharp. Knox's lips parted, but no words came. Ivy watched him carefully. The way his fists relaxed. The way his gaze shifted, not in defeat, but in reckoning. He turned to her at last, his voice quieter. "You have every reason to hate me." Ivy didn't answer. He looked at Walter. Then back at her. "I can't undo what I did. But I can own it." He took a step forward. "I'm sorry, Ivy. For firing you. For silencing you. For treating you like nothing." He inhaled shakily. "You were right to speak up. And I intend to make things right, starting with the company." Ivy didn't speak immediately. She didn't trust apologies wrapped in suits. But this one wasn't hollow. Not with Walter standing beside her. She nodded, once. Just enough. The music resumed softly behind them. Glasses clinked again. But something had shifted in that room, something that couldn't be undone. 3 people. 3 fractured lives. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to stitch them back together. Justice was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed the Christmas gala, true change began to ripple, not through headlines or lawsuits, but through people. Ivy didn't just win her case. She sparked a reckoning. Knox Wilder followed through on his promises. He returned every dollar his company owed her, down to the last cent, with interest. But more than that, he implemented sweeping reforms: anonymous whistleblower protections, fair wage evaluations, mental health benefits, and a new HR leadership that no longer answered to profit margins. People noticed. Employees who had once walked on eggshells now stood taller. Meetings began with listening. Decisions were questioned in the best way. And Ivy? She chose not to return to Wilder Enterprises. That chapter had closed. But with Walter's guidance, she accepted a creative director role at a socially driven startup, one that designed sustainable fashion and reinvested profits into communities in need. It was more than a job. It was purpose. She worked with heart. She slept through the night. She laughed again. And Walter, he stayed. The man who once sat alone on a bench on Christmas morning now spent his days walking with Ivy through parks, helping her vet talent for the new company, and most importantly, having dinner every Sunday night with his son. Knox and Walter didn't repair everything overnight. But the silence between them was gone. They argued. They disagreed. But now, they spoke. And sometimes, that's the most miraculous thing of all. On Christmas Eve, 1 year later, Ivy stood once again in the Wilder estate. But this time, she wasn't a guest stepping into a stranger's home. She was family. The party was smaller this year, intentional. Warmer. Real. Candlelight flickered across garlands of pine and gold. Soft music played in the background. And near the fireplace, Ivy stood with a glass of champagne in one hand, the other resting on Walter's arm as he told a story to a laughing guest. Knox approached, 2 glasses in hand. He handed her one and offered a crooked, boyish smile. "No lawsuits this year," he teased. Ivy chuckled. "Not unless you screw up again." He grinned. "Fair." They clinked glasses. Across the room, someone called out, "Group photo." Walter joined them. The 3 stood close, awkward for a beat. Then natural. The camera flashed. A moment, captured. A miracle, not born of magic, but of choices. As they returned to their seats, Ivy looked at the 2 men beside her. So different. So deeply connected. And for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. Not because everything was perfect, but because the pieces, once scattered, now fit together. As Knox raised his glass, Ivy followed. Walter smiled, eyes glassy. "To kindness," he said, voice soft. "To justice," Knox added. "And Ivy?" She looked at them both. "To second chances." 3 glasses met in the soft clink of crystal and hope. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not bitter. Not cold. But quiet, like a blessing. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness become the most powerful turning points. A warm meal. A listening ear. A decision to stay when the world expects you to walk away. Kindness without condition, that's what changed everything for Ivy Quinn. Not wealth. Not revenge. But a quiet, unspoken belief that doing good matters, even when no one is watching. Justice didn't come easily. It never does. But with courage, persistence, and someone who believes in you, even the impossible can be reclaimed. And as for power, power fades. But love, family, and redemption, those are the threads that hold a life together. Because sometimes, you have to lose what you thought mattered to find what truly does. And sometimes, one selfless moment can change not just one life, but many.